Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Design Challenge 2020, organized by UNDP in collaboration with the Idea Consultant and Ministry of Environment as well. Today's sessions is the expert sessions with me, the founding principal of the Idea Consultancy. The Idea Consultancy is the social firms providing creative solutions that have positive, lasting social impact and working toward a more sustainable business and consumer culture. The expert session today is part of the expert session series that we're talking to different experts in waste management to arrive at different perspective and creative and interesting insights to help our participants and candidates who wish to join the Urban Challenge, Design Challenge, to get to know more about the issue and have more technical know-hows on how to design the right bin. So we have today with you today with us G, coming from Poland. G, the floor is yours to talk a little bit about yourself and also about the idea as well. But before we doing that, just a little bit of information for participants. The session is recorded. So if anyone who would love to watch this recording, please go to UNDP page. We will post all the links to all the expert sessions there. And G, the floor is yours.
Cool. Hi. Hello. My name is G, and thank you very much for inviting me to the session today. I really right behind what you guys are trying to do with innovating bins in Phnom Penh. There's a very strong need in the community for this. For me, what I do is I'm a consultant, and I happen to be doing teaching a course called Leading with Empathy. So it's right up my alley, and it's something which we use empathy for in terms of like design thinking and human-centered design and creating solutions for our clients or for the community, for the government, for NGOs and things. So it's what I live in. I swim in this, and for me, this journey started many years ago. when I used to live in Singapore, and always seeing how things were developing. So my dad was in construction, and Singapore was constantly developing and moving, and products would change, things would change all the time. And I was wondering, like, why did this happen? And his answer was really simple: is that like he instilled in me this idea that nothing is ever perfect. Your products and solutions are never perfect, and you can always improve on them, and you can improve on them by studying and looking at how people use them. And that opened up this whole new world to me, that other people don't feel or experience the same things that I do, and from them that built a curiosity in me, to try and learn more about people. And then I applied that into solutions so I can start paying myself to be able to do this. So yeah, that's about me, I think, in a quick nutshell. I'm sorry, you're on mute. I cannot hear you.
Okay, my bad. Gee, it's a great introduction from you. You've been known for an advocate for design thinking, especially your consulting firm in Cambodia, the idea. My very first question to you is that why design thinking and why not other approach?
I mean, you could use other methods or solutions. I personally think design thinking is better because you're putting yourselves in the shoes of the user, and therefore it's more useful. And like I mentioned before, is that like one of the I guess the core principles and the pitfalls that people fall into is that they like, I would phrase it this way, is that you're not your customer, and I mean, just think about a 45-year-old man designing period pads for 13-year-old girls. They would never really understand the problem. They would never use it. It would be very difficult to get them to apply it. And so it doesn't make sense. I'm not sure if you know this, but for the longest time, men were designing bras, and it wasn't very comfortable or functional, for women, and actually only became more functional and comfortable when a woman started designing it. And I think maybe a more polite example, I'll use one more recently at the trampoline park that we operate. Our customers, for example, would tell us that the stairs they felt were uncomfortable or dangerous. They said, oh, like, I'm not sure about my kid on it. But that's as much as the feedback that you would get. And traditionally, if you use a more traditional problem solving method, you would get the feedback like existing data that you have, which is just customers are saying that, hey, this is maybe dangerous or it's uncomfortable. And then you, as the person creating a solution, would, okay, sit down and think, well, then if it's dangerous, then I'll put more padding on it. Then I'll do this, then I'll do that. And it's fairly reactive in the way that it is, the solutions are being proposed. And so what I noticed with my team, and this is not the idea team, it's a separate team. The immediate response was, okay, we'll do we'll do some padding and things like that. And that led to heaps of little solutions that we kept doing, which never really resolved the problem, because we found that when little kids were using it, they then had a problem with solution one. Whereas for the older parents, they would use it and be like, yeah, this is great, but the kids were still having problems with it. So we didn't really solve the entire issue. And we kept doing this, right? Until I stepped in and I said, okay, what we're going to have to do is some design thinking techniques, using empathy and some empathy techniques like body storming, where, we would actually work with the child, like a 5-year-old, and look at how they were climbing up the stairs. And then we would try it ourselves by like standing on our knees, for example, and walking up and figuring out height and where rails really needed to be. We also recognized who were the ones that, the people using the stairs. We realized it wasn't just kids and adults. We were elderly people carrying things because there was birthday parties upstairs. So there was so much stuff that we realized that we didn't account for in the first solution. So I would say that the biggest difference is empathy, in terms of design thinking versus more traditional methods. The second thing is that the data that you're working off is very different. There's a lot of assumptions with traditional methods. So even if you've categorized the different people using it, unless you do more empathetic techniques, you won't really understand them. And when you don't get that, then you don't get the visibility or the information needed. And that's what empathy does. It gives you visibility and an understanding of what people are feeling, thinking, and doing, and the core principle behind that is that you don't understand that. It's a very humbling approach is what I would say. And why using what I call incomplete data, or using only customer feedback, which is super helpful, but it's incomplete, is because your customers are not technical experts. They'll tell you the surface problem of the symptom of the problem. They'll say it's uncomfortable. That's a symptom. That's at the end, but they're not telling you the core problem. The core problem could be that the type of material that you use for your stairs or the bin or whatever, for example, is not useful. But they don't know this. They only know what they're experiencing, which is at the end of the solution already, right? And for you, the designer of this solution, you have to look at the whole picture, right? And they're only giving you a piece of it, which is at the feedback stage. So for me, I would say that it gives you much more complete information, and it's much more direct and useful. But of course, I would say that I'm advocating for it. So in my experience, that's how I would answer your question, I would say.
Great. We learned from you today, G, that design thinking is basically something that, in addition to traditional approach of trying to understand, the pain point of customer by looking at complete pictures, not just customer feedback, doing market surveys and reading from data that may lack the technical expertise that the user themselves may not be aware of in the first place. So you mentioned a lot of things about understanding your users, deep dives, observing them, exercise your empathy, maybe trying to show more empathy. What do you really mean by the empathy? So how do you apply the empathy? in your product design, let's say from your past experience. Can you share with us any example?
Yeah, well, one of the first things that we do is just to make sure that we're ready to do it, because before you give empathy, you must have empathy yourself. And so I know that might sound a
Amazing.
bit odd, but you do need to do that, because unless you have this sort of energy to actually start applying it, it takes a lot of patience and tolerance, because you're hitting a lot of walls and there's a lot of blanks. You're like, I don't actually know how they feel or what that person would be doing or interacting with the thing. So you need to get to a mental space where you're actually relaxed and very open, to whether it's feedback or to going into uncharted territory, because it's very uncomfortable. I could tell you that in some situations, depending on what solution that you're trying to propose. So that's the very first step, is making sure that you yourself are ready to do it. You're relaxed and you're in a good mental zone. Your team are in a good mental zone, and that you're prepared for it. The second thing is there is a ton of steps that you could take, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. And so for this conversation, in terms of bins, the first thing that we would consider is, well, who is using it, and so looking at existing bins. And one of the first techniques is just to observe and to use photographic and videographic evidence, because it's one thing for for example, and I'm giving you some experience already, assigned team members to look or observe and then report back to the main team, and the main team is not watching. And unless there's photos and videos, there is a point in that communication from what was being observed to the person understanding what happened and then communicating that, and then the end people, the team who's brainstorming, receiving that information. So there's like 3 points where it can kind of go wrong. So you want to be able to take photo and video evidence, to photographs, videos, so everybody can see black and white without a trickle of doubt that that's actually what happened. Because again, everybody perceives things very differently. So when we talk about empathy, you have to understand bias, and everybody has bias, whether you like it or not. And so that's one of the first tips, is photo, video evidence. I can give you an actual example on that. So our team is helping to manage the national stadium. And at the very first thing that we were doing to try and empathize for the public who use the stadium, because our role is to make it a more cleaner, healthier, better place to experience the national stadium. I'll speak for myself. I had a lot of biases that I didn't realize I was aware of, and so we were up at 5 a.m. looking at interviewing people, and one of the tasks was to look up to propose an advertising package for sponsors. And we were thinking, okay, well, we now need to tell our sponsors who the audience is so we know who to sell to, right? And so we assumed that because it was free, we didn't expect that the, like high demographic people, like income people would be there because it's a free gym. We were thinking those sort of people would go to really expensive gyms, like the Place or CrossFit or whatever that they were doing. And so we took photos of everything. And then we realized that when we came back and studied this outside of being at the stadium, we looked at it flatly. We're like, oh my God, well, how many people are coming through cars, right? And then once we started looking at the cars, we realized that these were expensive cars. These were like $250,000 cars, like Rolls Royces and Mercedes and really expensive things. And we realized, hold on a minute, like our first assumption was wrong. We thought that the people driving in weren't using these sort of cars, but they are. And then we looked at that further, and we realized that the type of people using the stadium were not who we originally thought, And so I could tell you that using photo and video evidence is an empathetic, one of the tips and tricks that you should be using in terms of empathy, because it helps you check your biases, right? Because even though we say it's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, it's not really. It's about how they feel in their shoes, right? And by saying that, it checks your biases, and by putting the photo video evidence down, it checks your biases as well, because these are all massive blockages to empathy. Is your bias, your team's bias, and assumptions, and you don't realize what they are until you check. So that's one of the first things that you would do. The second thing, another example, is body storming, and this is probably one of the more common ones. So body storming is like brainstorming with your body, right? So if you're an architect and you're designing a school, for example, then like what I was saying before, you would get down on your knees and as an example and figure out height, right? Like kids who are like 7 are not adults, and the architect is an adult, right? So even though it might be aesthetically pleasing to do things, the board teachers might suggest more plants and things like that. And then we forget, well, what are kids doing with the place? Is it safe? How are we making sure that it's safe? How are we making sure that things are out of reach or locked or fun or engaging or whatever? And one of the only ways to do that is to try it. So going to, for example, an existing school and like doing that and joining a class with children, and you can feel it, and you'll start to see things that you didn't realize before that you would never ever experience if you're sitting in a meeting room with other adults in a white room with a projector and you go on Pinterest. That's traditional research, but it's not the same. You wouldn't get anywhere near the same like exciting or like deeper insights than you would get from body storming or other empathetic techniques, right? So that's the
It's
kind of
very
stuff that you would
important.
do.
Sorry, G, I have to hold you for that
Sure.
because you mentioned a very interesting technique, body storming. It's something that you advocate for every designers and policymakers or solution makers or solution designers to put themselves in the user's shoe, not just trying to observe, but also be there, experience of the service of the product themselves. So how do all of this like in your experience, especially the ideal work in Cambodia, how do all it translate into some sort of interesting insight you learn from? For example, what are the different when you do the body storming, and what are the things that you find if you miss the body storming in any product design or service or your journey to reach to achieve the solutions.
So what, just so I understand, so what is the difference if I don't do body storming, for example, when I'm creating a solution versus when I do?
Yes.
No, that first example that's the most immediate because for me, it's a very recent one. But when we were looking at the stairs, that was the first one because it meant more, it was more costly. It took a lot more time and a lot more customer complaints, because we didn't do it completely the first time. And we were just essentially putting on band-aids, and addressing the symptoms to the problem, until we actually tried to experience it ourselves, and that was quite interesting to see. So um, an example here, and I could use La Pria, as an example, because we would send our team members to other events to figure out waste management, to look how it was done. And it was easy and hard at the same time because it wasn't something that people thought about. Most people would think, oh, we just put bins down. But you go to a lot of events at pagodas and things like that, and there's still rubbish everywhere. There's litter all over the ground, and the bins are absolutely packed full. And so there's actually a difference between what you would say you can see in terms of events that there is definitely no body storming being done because it's not in their expertise. They're just not thinking about it. They're focusing on the event. And fair enough, that's what they want to focus on. And their intention is not waste management. Whereas La Pria was a social experiment for waste management. So that's all we were thinking about. And our event had very little to no litter because we were body storming, techniques. And we realized that, well, we were studying other people's events that putting a bin is not enough. People are still going to litter and forget waste, like trash separation. They just had one bin with a plastic bag and everybody just dumped it all in there, but nothing was being separated. And so what we were doing was in terms of body storming, like going to the event ourselves, and then we would add it, like our research team, our consultants would empty the bins ourselves as well to get the feeling of what it's like to be a trash collector as well, so that we would make sure that it was easy to access and empty. And there was a lot of research done in terms of going to other people's events, and Water Festival was where it all started for us. And there were a lot of insights there. And I'll use another body storming example for that. And just by turning up, we could see that when we bought or had waste, when we generated waste by eating something, then we had plastic wrappers or whatever, we will go to the bin and note down that when the bin was full, And when it was overwhelmingly full, it didn't even matter. People would just kind of chuck, the wind would blow, the trash would be all over the event site because the bins weren't being emptied enough. And that led to more people littering. And people said, oh, it doesn't matter since there's trash everywhere. Like, I don't need to go to a bin. And that's what people were saying. And that's how people felt. And we can't deny that. And so that told us that in terms of the bin design, we had to make sure that it was easy to access, easy to empty quickly. And that some of these things we realized were a little bit outside of our control, but we were thinking, well, what can we do to influence that? And that was only possible because we turned up to these events. We tried to empty the bins ourselves. We went to bins that were empty, went to bins that were full, half full, and got a feeling of what people felt when they turned up to a particular scenario or situation that we developed, right? And so, yeah, that's the difference. You would get
very,
in
very,
terms of
very practical and handy example, G.
yeah.
Especially we can take the inspiration from there is, by observing and joining other events, we can create our own events to actually starting monitor and then put ourselves really in the shoes and start, looking at the beams, how it works, sort of things.
Yeah.
So, G,
it
because
costs
of
more
this,
money and time.
totally,
If you want a simple answer, it's expensive to not do empathy. In the long run, empathy is it's a resource expensive approach. It takes more money and time just to do it, and tolerance and patience. But by not doing it in the long run, you're costing yourself much more than if you did it in the first place. So it's a much better investment.
Great, great. So, G, because of that, I was about to ask you, the learnings that you take from the Slap 3 years and other events, but you already covered some of that. So, how about the challenges you see? Because you also spent some time, as I know, living in Cambodia, and also you're running a couple of social events and experiments. And so, what are your experience? What do you see are the challenges that people face, with the current waste management, including the bin itself?
Oh, that's a big question. So, I mean, like, we'll summarize it into like 3 areas: people, process, and like physical infrastructure or tools. The challenges were everywhere. So when we first started, we found that we were the first problem because my original team at the time anyway we would blame Sentry a lot, and that needed to stop. We couldn't divert the conversation to honestly something that wasn't very useful, because and what helped was understanding that was a fixed variable. So what I mean by that is that we know we can't control them, so we need to stop thinking about it. Right? Like, stop complaining about it and figure, okay, so we know that isn't going to happen. Well, what can we do to make a desired behavior a lot easier to do? And so, for example, if that's the rubbish collectors, and if there is rubbish overspilling, what can we do to make sure that they don't just pick up the bag, but they also help pick up the stuff around it, or even prevent that from happening in the first place? So in order for that to happen, we had to start with ourselves and realize that what biases were we holding, and to make sure that we approached it the right way. And that meant that we took the step in the right direction. And I can't begin to stress how important that step is, or else your team, when you're doing brainstorming or body storming, whatever, you're just going around in circles, and it's not productive. The second thing, so much, the lack of infrastructure was a huge issue, because even if you separated trash, there wasn't a lot. So we were focusing on separating trash. And we started there, like, where does this stuff end up? So in the design thinking, you're working backwards, right? So that's something which I should definitely highlight here, that you're working backwards from the desired result. And you're also looking at the start, but you start there first and work your way backwards and go, oh, okay, for that to happen, well, these things need to happen. And for those things need to happen, these things need to happen. And then that gives you so many options and ideas, on what your next steps would be to get to that area, right? And you start with the end in mind. And of course, you're going to be much more successful, likely to be successful in your endeavor. So we started all the way there. And because we started there, we saw all these other problems as well. And we had to apply the whole fixed variable idea, say, okay, we don't control this, but we still want to be able to do that. Regardless of the situation, if people separated their trash, that's still a good thing. Let's try and focus on that anyway. right? And so we took that approach and still designed a bin station where there were 3 different bins. And that was confusing or difficult to do because how would we classify what kind of waste went where? And even organic waste was interesting because what we wanted to originally do was send it to farms for composting. But the problem was that it's not all compostable, not all biodegradable material is the same. You can't grade your green material the same way as you would meat, the same way that you would treated wood. But the problem is, and that led to a second issue, was that most of your people, the audience, the users, they don't know these things either. So we had a lot of learning to do about the waste system. We had to learn about waste and what was compostable and what isn't. And that led to many more questions, but we realized that a lot of people just don't know anything about trash. And so we had to prioritize. And here's another challenge. I hope you're writing all this down, not for you, but whoever's watching this, because I'm saying so many issues at once here.
Totally. Right.
People don't know what they don't know. And so we took the opportunity to design a bin with huge infographics and text in English and Khmer. But these were like nearly 2-meter tall bins that were 2 meters wide and like, I think 75 centimeters deep. So these were massive structures, which were mobile, but very heavy to move and expensive to make as well for us because it was these really big, bright things. But it was useful. One thing that we realized is that at Slapria, people looked at them. So people walked up to these bins and they would stop and look. And the people that did that were expats and parents. But young youths, like unless they were pro-environment, people didn't look. Elderly people didn't look. Children didn't look. So a huge demographic of people weren't actually looking at it. And they went up to it and they were like whatever. And they would just sort of check it in and go. But again, our approach for Slapria was a waste management event. And so our priority wasn't just the litter or trash separation, it was education and research. And we were trialing different things with the bins. Whereas in this particular example, you're kind of trying to get to the end result already, but you'd have to prioritize. Like, are you looking at anti-litter or are you looking at trash separation, or both, and each of these problem statements that you have will take you to will create a different solution or product. And what we did, or what I would recommend is actually to consider what your solution would be for each thing and to see if you can tick each problem statement to the solution that you have. So you'd have something a bit more encompassing, which is both anti-litter and to help with pro-trash separation and things like that as well. So the biggest problem was definitely if you're approaching it from in terms of if we're separating the users from the public who are using the bin, that means to dispose of the waste, I would recommend because the challenge there was that it's used by everybody. So you need to do an empathy map or body storming from everybody's perspective, who are using the bins most in public. And get some form of a ratio and say, well, if 90% of people are like that, then let's focus more of the solution around this first, and then the next thing in terms of, if we're still looking at users, people, would be the people who are collecting the trash. And what we had were baskets, and they were quite low, and that was quite hard on everyone's backs because the trash got quite heavy. And the thing is, these woven baskets that we had, they were super wide and they didn't fit the traditional bag size. So the first event at Slapria, we used cassava bags because they were biodegradable. And then we found out that biodegradable there are different levels of this. Cassava bags are only like 60% biodegradable. And what happens is that the organic material, which will compost quicker, will compost first, but the other chemical items in it don't biodegrade as quick. They might take 1,000 years. And what you get at the end of the day is pieces of plastic, microplastics, as opposed to a large plastic, which you could just remove and 100% of it is gone. But in 5 years, that biodegradable biodegradable cassava bag has lots of little pieces, which is so much harder to remove from the environment. Anyway, so that led to other issues. We realized that some of the components that we had led to further problems. Anyway, when we were looking at the bin size, we had to make sure that the bags that we were using had to be well, more useful, because they wouldn't fit. And so we had these super wide bags, super wide baskets, or bins, so to speak. And then the bag would only cover half of the space. And so we would have litter on half of the basket and the other litter, like the rubbish, in the actual bag itself. It was too low, very difficult to carry. And because it was low, it overfilled really, really quickly. And we realized that some trash generated much more than others. And so because it was sloppy, we had a lot of organic trash, like chicken bones, chopsticks. We were encouraging our vendors to use banana leaf plates. And so we had a lot of organic trash, and that overfilled. The other thing was plastic bottles, because our sponsor was Pepsi. And so there were bottles and cans. Even if these things are recyclable, still not ideal. Even if these things are recyclable, well, sorry. The problem is that these bottles and cans are quite big unless they're squashed. And so that also took up trash really quickly. And so the rate of the filling rate, so to speak, of each bin that we used filled up differently. And so that was quite interesting to see. And because we were a food festival, of course, we would get more organic material. We would get bottles and cans, but we wouldn't get less things like inorganic material. So thinking about where your bins are being placed is super important, and what kind of trash is likely going to be generated or like put into it. Yeah. Oh my God, I did a lot of talking. So I have much more. There are so many more insights, and that was just to do with users and people, let alone processes and the physical infrastructure. Because I'll
But
move. I'll move forward. We can talk
I may
about.
have to stop you for this question, because you're sharing
Sure. Okay.
a lot
Great.
of
Please
wide
do,
range
because I could talk about this for ages.
of
About waste management.
Great. It sounds like you're so into it, and a lot of observations and design thinking processes into some of these very topic, and especially it's luxury event. But G, I want to deep dive specifically on the waste bin itself. So maybe you touch upon that, the challenge regarding pre-pour process and equipment, the product itself. So if we talk about the bins nowadays, so give me three things. I know you have a lot of things going on there. So give me the top three that you think are the challenges in the bin or in the design currently you see in Cambodia. What are the gaps in design, or what are the challenges in the design of the bins that we use every day?
The first two things, the third one I'll have to think about, but the first two that by far come to mind is, the first one will probably be production. Making the bin and finding the right technical expertise or the right materials to use it was by far the biggest problem. And it's something which we still haven't resolved because of what's available in the market. The second thing would be the users, because we are like, because it's not we have to understand that this problem is a we problem. And so our problem collectively as a community is that we're not aligned on it, and so about litter and also about trash separation. And so we don't have concrete processes. We don't even have set color codes for the country as to what is what. And so that doesn't, like, people might like, green is fairly understandable, but you look at other items of waste, we don't have a set color code to designate to each one. And so red, what does that mean to someone, or blue or yellow or whatever color that you choose to mark out your bins and the type of waste that you want to have, if you design a bin that separates trash, which I highly recommend. So we don't have a consensus. We're not all aware of the same things either. And so that's what our research tells us as well. So we would, from what we found, for example, at the Women Memorial, was that we did about 368 interviews over 3 days from 4 a.m. to midnight. And we found that provincial people, for example, know that littering is bad. That was one thing that was interesting, is that people know that littering is bad, but they still do it because they say that there's not enough bins. But secondly is that they don't remember any campaigns. as well. And so in terms of dialogue, public dialogue, it's not in the same spot. And so for you designing the bin, you have to understand that people are aware that actually they shouldn't litter, but they complain of not seeing bins. And so that's something which is quite interesting. The second thing is trash separation. On that, because of this, because we're not on the same page on what it means to put trash into a bin, trash separation, we need to educate them, and even where that goes and how it's separated. Um, you'll get a lot of ongoing issues from that. What we had to do was still separate the trash, even though we had trash separators in our bins, and so that was quite a challenge for us, is that because it led to adding in more resources into the process, which made it fairly expensive, to do for us at the event anyway. But again, we were looking at this from a big picture view, because we had to apply resources to those things as well. Maybe that second point was 2 points. The first one was awareness, and the second one is understanding on trash separation in terms of challenges.
Great.
Anyway, but the first one by far is production. It's really difficult to make these things with the right materials and to source them.
Picking on that, just out of my curiosity, like, because we've been speaking to different speakers coming from different backgrounds, and I think like we agree on one thing, is that in Cambodia the waste bin is not consolidated, and it's there's no color code or a set symbols or icons to represent each bin. What a red bin does. What does a green bin means to people? So this kind of thing. What do you find it like? Is it something that something to do with a national guidelines, something to do with the designer themselves, or what is your recommendation to that? Because people based on observation, sharing from others, experts and speakers, and also I myself living in country. Sometimes we find it a little bit, you go to the beans and you see there are four beans, and you kind of hesitant. So which one should I throw my cup of, coffee? So is it the red bean? Is it the yellow? Or is it the green one? So maybe because you are a foreigners, you live in Cambodia and other countries, and what do you see? What are your recommendations to making a national guidelines for waste bins? Where to start it? Of course, you're gonna say empathy, design thinking, but maybe there are something else that we may not know, and your thinking and your experience may enlighten and give inspiration to the designers listening to this call.
I know I'm the empathy guy, but as far as that goes, in terms of design thinking, like empathy, like we're talking about users and how it relates, so you get a much more complete solution. But to answer your question, if we're putting on the policy advising hat, then you have to look at the infrastructure to see where it's all going. And unless you start there, it honestly doesn't make sense to separate the trash. And that's the reality that we're currently in. So, I'm just speaking my opinion. That's in my honest opinion. That's where I believe, to answer that question on, in my opinion, where should this begin, and what do we do about that problem where we're not on the same page, essentially, on how do you, like, which bin does my coffee cup go into, or like my bottle cap, is that like, or like I might be eating something and there's a bit of wood and there's a bit of organic waste, or for example, or I don't know which which of these bins do these go to. So there has to be some consensus, and ideally it starts from the public sector, like from the government, to say, hey, look, guys, this is what we're doing in Cambodia. And to work backwards around that, you would look at the surrounding nations and see what these guys are doing as well. And so there is some sort of, at least it's cohesive among the Mekong region, for how we're all approaching waste. And the thing is, it's this ecosystem. We forget that even though we're looking within our borders, that the trash waste we're all affected by it. If, for example, I don't want to say Thailand, but if the waste in the sea, which can come from anywhere, mainly neighboring countries, comes in, it washes up on our shore. Whatever waste that we chuck in or we don't dispose of correctly ends up on their shores as well. You know, and a lot of our rubbish doesn't even get processed in Cambodia. It goes to Vietnam or Thailand or whatever, wherever that it goes to. And so the thing is, we don't have the infrastructure to even deal with it ourselves yet. There are definitely plans for doing this, but we're just not at that stage yet. And so if we're looking at the really big picture, your bin design is a stepping stone in this much larger linear journey that we have, because in future these bins are probably going to change, but you want to get to the best first step, which in the greater scheme of things is probably going to be an educational tool as well, but one which defines everybody getting on the same page over what type of trash is what color. And the like, for example, coffee cups might be super common, so understanding what kind of trash goes into what and using that as an icon. You know, thinking about how this bin will look like in streets, at the Olympic Stadium, at the Riverside, and doing a mock-up and seeing what, and that's just one part of the bin thing, like in terms of design, like what does it look like in all these different places, you know, and at malls and stuff like that. So all of the public facilities or facilities that offer bins can all get on the same page, and you don't just have like one unit, you have the same ones, and everybody who's using these bins all over the country will be able to get on board and say, well, okay, that's mandated now. That's what we're all going to have to use. So everyone is just forced onto the same page. And if you look at other countries, that's what's had to happen. It was less of a carrot type of technique and more of a stick. You know, you look at Singapore and they force it. Like you get silly high fines, you know, for littering, or even in New Zealand, like the waste management companies will call you up if you have been consistently putting the wrong kind of trash in the wrong bin. But what that does is that it's a community service. Like it's an everyone problem, and everybody should be doing this. And I think that kind of campaigning should be one also about civic duty. I don't think that you're going to be able to encompass that in your bin. Maybe you might actually, but you know, if we're, because sorry, your question was a very big picture one, and so I'm giving you a big picture view. But yeah, for if you're asking my professional opinion, see it as a stepping stone. Talk to all the other people that are having to use the bin, you know, and what their plans are, and what we think in general a greater plan is for waste management in Cambodia, and seeing, okay, now I see where this is all going. That kind of bin needs to be like this, you know, and you will probably have to be the one to suggest why it's that. You actually are going to have to suggest and defend that as to why you're suggesting a certain color, shape, size, or icons, text, font. All these things are actually quite important in your bin design, and you need to stress test that. And stress testing is a part of double checking your bin design to make sure that you've taken this mock-up, several options of it. You've gone to a child, you've gone to a 35-year-old Khmer lady who's doing dancing at the stadium, for example, and what she might say differently to the guys playing volleyball who are also using these bins. And then you get to a tighter solution because you've tested it. Did I answer your question? I hope I did. God, I went on a rant on that one.
Great. You know, I know we can talk about this like for hours. You're so into this. That's why we're glad to have you here, G. Of course, the question is really something that we try to observe and capture from our participants as well. We got a couple of things, you know, coming up to our social medias, thinking about, you know, where should I start when there is no standard or guidelines to go, you know, there's no reference, there's no benchmark for me to do, like, you know, so where we should start. Maybe this is the best answer we got from you is we are the start. You know, we set the standard, we set the guideline, we set the colors, you know, why we need green, why we need blue or yellow or maybe purple, who knows. You know, this is something that the urban design challenge is trying to solve. We totally agree. The bin that we're trying to design is part of many solutions. It's a circular approach. We need multiple solutions, you know, coming from different angles. So one of the angles we're trying to do is how can we make sure that the bin works well in promoting separating of waste and public littering, limiting people encouraging people to use the bin more often and effectively. And next step, and more partners and others like Ministry of Environment are doing on the recycling strategy, bringing in recycling investment to make a large scale recycling facility. So this is all part together into putting all together. And you make a really good point. Especially, I think it will be very beneficial for the designers and the candidates who love to submit their concept. Is that to looking at this as a bird eye view, like what is going on in a country nationwide, the policy guidelines, starting from A to Z, so that the bin designs go in line together with that. So G, we're coming to an end, but I have the last part for you, and I'm sure you're very excited about that. It's your golden chance to tell us, what would you want to see in the new or the next generation beans, or maybe in the urban design. What would you like to see? What would you want the beans to have? Like feel free to use your imaginations and opinion.
My ideal world is one where we don't even really need them. Like we get to a point where we approach waste as something which, if we talk circular economy, for example, then we look at an area where, a world where we can consume products and services without having to generate waste. It's all part of the plan. It's already used for all these other things, and you know exactly what to do with it. I mean, if we're going to go really, really crazy, in terms of convenience and ease of use, it should be something I feel like mobile, something which is present anywhere that you need it. It's something which is zero emissions. It doesn't generate further issues or problems. So if you're using materials that could be made out of, I'm seeing like if I had to not design it myself, but if I had to look at it as a public member who wants to see this happen, it would be made out of recycled materials, something which is removing trash from the ecosystem to generate something productive. It will be something which when people see, they can go, yeah, I get it. And I know exactly what that is and how to use it. That when I walk past it, I don't smell it, I don't see it. That is not ugly. That was an issue that we had at Slapria. Our bins were not covered. And so it just looked bad. Yeah, terrible. Something which I think could be positive. I think it should blend in and be a nice feature of wherever that it's in, that it's pleasant to the eye. It should be designed well because it makes up a part of our city, and I think it's important that it encompasses some of these elements, and it's like it looks both it's universally understandable that it's a bin and you know how to use it, but at the same time it's Khmer. It looks cool. Like when people come and visit Cambodia, that they're like, man, that's cool. And I'm gonna take a photo with a bin because that's so interesting. I've never seen something like that before. I think that'll be really cool to take that opportunity to do something fun and exciting, because then people will actually use it. And I think that's of understanding human behavior. It needs to be exciting, and yeah, I would say, simply put, that's it. And of course, easy to use for whoever has to empty the bin as well. Super easy to use, because if it's not, then they're not going to use it. We don't want to break someone's back.
On that last part, we also making sure that we've been talking to informal waste picker and waste collectors, so that we take into consideration of their experience with the bins. When they have to empty the trash in the bin as well, and that's just covering your last point, making sure that point is taken into consideration into the design and implementation. All right, geez. Any last comments or sharing suggestion to our candidates, who will be watching this video?
Got a really cliche one, and it's to have fun. Like, I think you come up with the best things when you're really enjoying yourself. Like, smile and have a good time with it, because I think this is like it'll really come off in your solution. That you could tell when someone's had really fun time making, like for us, and why I would say our events and things like that are successful, because we apply empathy, but we have such a great time doing it. and we laugh about it. We're like, ooh, these people are going to find that really fun, or that's going to be really interesting. And we can't wait for people to see, you know, this thing that we've done. And you can tell that, like, a customer can feel that. They can absolutely, or the user can feel that you had a really good time, or you really put some effort into the design of something, or into the use of it, and they enjoy it. And when they enjoy it, people will keep using it. So definitely have fun while doing it. Keep yourself in check. So even when you're doing the debates, you know, your brain, because brainstorming, you don't say no, but after brainstorming, you have objections and you need solutions. And so you're splitting your team into two, a red team and a blue team, and you're kind of like fighting it out. Just remember that when you leave that meeting, you've set it, you know, like the rules for it, to say, when we leave this meeting room, we're still, you know, we're still having fun with the project, and that we're making sure that we have a good solution, but this doesn't damage the friendship or anything like that. And so one good step for this is very much about having fun and enjoying what you're doing.
Great tips. I hope, you know, all the candidates and participants, you know, find this conversation useful and insightful to have them, you know, coming up with the ideas and concepts to design the beams in this challenge. And thank you, G, for your time, and thank you for all the thoughtful sharings and insight. I find it very interesting myself. I learned a new term, body storming. I would imagine to call it body storming. I hope that's the right term to do. And thank you so much. And I wish you all the best for this week, and hope to see you and work with you later.
Thank you. Well, I hope everybody comes up with, I'm really interested in seeing some of the designs. So best of luck to all the participants. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, G. Do follow us on Facebook. You will see the design coming.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.